The last thing Elena expected when the sirens wailed that October night was to find herself pressed against a stranger's chest in a bomb shelter barely wider than a coffin. The raids had been coming closer to the village for weeks now, distant. Thunder that made the windows rattle and sent the chickens into hysterics. But tonight, the thunder had teeth. Elena clutched her mother's worn shawl and stumbled through the blackout darkness, following the desperate shuffle of neighbors toward the old root cellar behind the church. She squeezed through the narrow entrance just as the first explosions lit the horizon. Inside, bodies packed together like sardines in the suffocating dark. The air tasted of damp earth and fierce sweat. Someone's elbow jabbed her ribs. A child whimpered somewhere near her feet. Then the entrance collapsed. Not completely, a blessing. That would save their lives, but enough to trap them in a space meant for turnips, not 23 terrified souls. The bombing continued overhead, each blast sending dirt cascading from the ceiling like deadly snow. "Easy now," came a voice. Near her ear, steady as bedrock despite the chaos. "Breathe slow. We're safer than we seem." Elena turned toward the voice and found herself staring into eyes that caught what little light filtered through the debris. Even in the gloom, she could make out strong features, a jaw that spoke of stubborn determination and work roughened, hands that gestured calmly as he helped an elderly woman settle against the wall. "You're not from here," she whispered, though she couldn't say why she was certain. "Passing through." His accent carried traces of the northern provinces. "Bad timing, it seems." A tremendous crash shook the shelter, and instinctively Elena pressed closer to this stranger who emanated such unshakable calm. She caught the scent of pine soap and leather, clean and masculine in the fetid air. "What's your name?" she asked, needing something to anchor herself as the world exploded above them. "Thomas." He shifted slightly, creating more space for her without moving away entirely. "And you're Elena. I heard someone call to you outside." She nodded, then realized he couldn't see the gesture clearly. "How long do you think?" Another explosion, closer this time. The shelter groaned like a living thing in pain. Dust rained down, and Elena felt Thomas's arm come around her shoulders. Not presumptuous, but protective, natural as breathing. "Could be hours," he said honestly. "The raids usually last until dawn." Hours, pressed together in this tomb-like space with a man she'd never seen before tonight. Elena had been raised to guard her reputation fiercely. Unmarried women didn't find themselves alone with strange men, certainly not in such intimate circumstances. But propriety seemed ridiculous when death hammered at their door. "Tell me something," she said, desperate to focus on anything but the terrifying sounds above. "Something that has nothing to do with bombs or war." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that seemed to push back the darkness. "There's a meadow near my home where wild roses grow. They bloom twice a year, once in spring like you'd expect, and then again in autumn when everything else is dying. My grandmother always said they were stubborn flowers, too foolish to know when to quit." Elena smiled despite everything. "I like stubborn flowers." "So, do I." She felt rather than saw him turn toward her. "What about you? What grows in your world when the bombs aren't falling?" "Lavender," she said without hesitation. "Fields of it behind our cottage. My mother makes soap from it and sachets for the linen chest. The whole house smells like summer, even in winter." They talked through the long night, quietly, careful not to disturb the others who dozed fitfully or wept softly in the darkness. Thomas told her about his work as a clockmaker, how he loved the precision of tiny gears and springs, the satisfaction of bringing stop time back to life. Elena shared her dreams of teaching children, of having a classroom filled with sunlight and books instead of the factory work that currently claimed her days. Somewhere in those whispered conversations, her hand found his. Their fingers intertwined as naturally as roots seeking water, and Elena felt something shift in her chest, a recognition so profound it frightened her she'd been courted before. The baker's son had been particularly persistent, bringing her sweet rolls and stammering compliments. But those attentions had felt like performances, careful dances around propriety and expectation. This, whatever this was blooming between her and a stranger in a bomb shelter, felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. "Elena," Thomas said as the bombing finally began to fade with the approaching dawn. His thumb traced gentle circles. On her knuckles. I need to tell you something. Her heart stuttered. In the growing light seeping through the debris, she could see his face more clearly now, the worry lines around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words. I'm not just passing through, he said quietly. I'm running. The admission hung between them like a blade. Elena felt the warmth in her chest crystallize into something sharp and complicated. Running could mean so many things in these times. Desertion, treason, resistance, or simply the desperate flight of someone who'd lost everything. But before she could ask what haunted him enough to drive him into the night, voices called from outside. Rescue had arrived. AS hands pulled away the debris blocking their entrance. As blessed fresh air rushed into their underground tomb, Elena realized she faced an impossible choice. In a few minutes, this stranger who'd somehow claimed her heart in the space of one terrifying night would disappear into the chaos of war, unless she did something unthinkable. But what price would such boldness demand, and was her heart prepared to pay it? The morning light struck Elena's eyes like a physical blow after the shelter's darkness. She blinked hard, her hands still clasped in Thomas's as villagers pulled them from their underground refuge one by one. The church behind them stood intact, a miracle, but smoke rose from 3 houses on the eastern edge of town. Thank the Lord, Father Benedict breathed, helping Mrs. Kowalski to her feet. The old priest's cassock was torn and dirt-stained, but his voice carried its familiar authority. Everyone accounted for. Elena heard the roll call, as if through water. Her attention remained fixed on Thomas, who stood beside her scanning the crowd with careful eyes. In daylight, she could see details that darkness had hidden, the quality of his coat despite its travel wear, the precise way he moved, like a man accustomed to being watched. You there, called Henrik the blacksmith, pointing at Thomas with a soot-blackened finger. Don't know your face. Thomas stepped forward, his posture respectful but unafraid. Thomas Brennan, sir. I was seeking lodging when the raids began. This young lady. He gestured to Elena. She helped guide me to safety. Elena's breath caught. He was protecting her reputation even as he exposed himself to scrutiny. A deserter, if that's what he was, would have slipped away in the confusion, not lingered to ensure her honor remained intact. Brennan, Henrik, mused, his suspicious expression softening slightly. There's Brennan's up in Millfield. You kin to the clockmaker there. My uncle, Thomas replied smoothly. I've been traveling south, looking for work. The war has made timepieces scarce, but broken clocks, well, they're everywhere. A murmur of understanding passed through the crowd. Everyone had possessions damaged by the bombings, clocks among them. Elena admired how Thomas had taken a detail from their conversation and woven it into believable truth, but Father Benedict's sharp eyes narrowed. Strange time to be traveling, son. Most young men your age are serving the cause in other ways. The moment stretched taut as wire. Elena felt Thomas tense beside her, felt the weight of unspoken secrets pressing against his carefully maintained calm. Around them, neighbors who'd shared the night's terror now studied this stranger with growing suspicion. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the wild roses Thomas had described, stubborn flowers that bloomed when wisdom said they should wither. Sometimes, she realized, foolishness and courage looked exactly the same. Father, she said, stepping closer to Thomas, there's something you should know. Every face turned toward her. Thomas's hand tightened on hers in warning, but Elena pressed forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. Thomas and I, we're to be married. The silence that followed felt deeper than the bomb shelter's darkness. Elena could hear her own pulse, could feel Thomas's shock radiating through their joined hands. She'd just committed them both to either salvation or disaster. Mrs. Kowalski gasped. Elena, child, what are you saying? We've been corresponding. Elena continued, the lie flowing more easily now that she'd begun. For months, he came here to ask Father Benedict to perform the ceremony, but then the raids. She let her voice trail off, allowing their imaginations to fill the gaps. Father Benedict's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. This is the first I'm hearing of any such arrangement, child. We wanted to surprise everyone, Elena said acutely, aware that her entire future, and possibly Thomas's life, balanced on her ability to convince these people she'd known since childhood. With so much sadness in the world, We hope to bring some joy. She turned to look at Thomas, pouring every ounce of sincerity she possessed into her eyes, silently begging him to play along. For a heartbeat, she saw pure terror in his expression, not of bombs or bullets, but of the trust she'd just placed in him. Then his face transformed. The careful mask fell away, replaced by something so tender and genuine that Elena almost forgot they were acting. I know it seems sudden, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion that sounded entirely real. But when you find someone who makes the world make sense again, well, war teaches you not to waste time. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to Elena's knuckles. The gesture sent electricity up her arm and drew sighs from the watching women. Young love, Mrs. Kowalski murmured, her suspicion melting into sentimental approval. Though your poor mother will faint dead away when she hears, Elena. My mother knows, Elena lied smoothly. She's been helping me prepare my trousseau. More murmurs, these approving. In their small village, where courtships followed predictable patterns and marriages were arranged as much by practical consideration as affection, a romance conducted in secret letters carried an appealing whiff of scandal, but Henrik wasn't entirely convinced. If you're engaged, why haven't you been called up for service? Every able-bodied man. Clockmakers are essential trades, Father Benedict interrupted, surprising Elena. Especially now, with so much equipment damaged. The military needs men who can repair delicate mechanisms. He studied Thomas with calculating eyes. Though I'll need to see proper documentation, of course. Thomas nodded gravely. Of course, Father. My papers are with my tools, back at the inn. I can retrieve them as soon as the roads are cleared. Good. The priest's tone carried unmistakable warning. We'll need to discuss the marriage arrangements as well. Assuming, of course, that both parties are still committed to this course of action in the clear light of day. Elena felt the weight of his words. Father Benedict was offering them an escape, a chance to claim that fear and proximity had led them to make promises they didn't intend to keep. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. She looked at Thomas, this stranger who'd held her through the longest night of her life, who'd shared his dreams of wild roses and precise machinery, who'd protected her reputation at the cost of exposing himself to danger. I've never been more certain of anything, she said to Thomas's eyes searched her face as if trying to decode a message written in a foreign language. Whatever he found there must have reassured him, because he squeezed her hand and nodded. Then we have arrangements to make, Father Benedict said briskly. The church may be intact, but there's much to be done. Elena, I assume you'll want time to prepare properly. Actually, Father, Elena said, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. We'd like to be married today. This time the gasps were audible. Mrs. Kowalski pressed her hand to her chest in shock. Today, Father Benedict's voice climbed an octave. Child, marriage is a sacred institution, not something to be rushed into because of what, Father? Elena interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. Because I've found a good man who makes me feel safe in an unsafe world? Because I'd rather spend whatever time we might have as his wife than wonder what could have been. She turned to address the gathered crowd. These people who'd watched her grow from child to woman, who knew her as practical Elena, sensible Elena, Elena who always colored inside the lines. We shared something in that shelter, she said, her voice carrying across the morning air. Not just fear, but understanding. Recognition. Call it God's will or call it madness. But I know with absolute certainty that this man is meant to be my husband. The silence stretched long enough for Elena to wonder if she'd finally pushed too far. Then Mrs. Kowalski began to cry, not tears of shock, but of joy. Oh, you beautiful, foolish girl, the old woman said, pulling Elena into a fierce embrace. Love like that, it's rarer than peace in wartime. Other voices joined in. Congratulations, exclamations, practical concerns about flowers and food for a wedding feast on such short notice. But Elena barely heard them. Her attention remained fixed on Thomas, who watched her with an expression of such profound wonder that she felt her cheeks burn. Are you certain? He asked quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. Elena, you don't know what you're taking on. What I've done, what I'm running from, then tell me, she whispered back. We'll face it together. Before Thomas could respond, Father Benedict clapped his hands for attention. If we're to have a wedding today, there's much to prepare. Elena, you'll need witnesses, and we should send word to your mother. No time for that. Elena said quickly, panic fluttering in her chest. Her mother would ask too many questions, would see through the deception in minutes. She's visiting my aunt in the next county. She'll understand when she returns. It was another lie in a growing collection, but Father Benedict seemed to accept it. Very well. Mrs. Kowalski, perhaps you could help Elena prepare? And Thomas, you'll need to retrieve those papers we discussed. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the unexpected wedding, Elena felt the magnitude of what she'd set in motion settling over her like a lead blanket. In a few hours, she would be married to a man whose secrets might destroy them both. But what choice did she have when her heart had already made its decision? The church bells rang at sunset, their bronze voices carrying across the village like a benediction. Elena stood before the cracked mirror in Mrs. Kowalski's cottage, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The borrowed wedding dress, ivory, silk that had belonged to the blacksmith's daughter, fit her slender frame perfectly, though the lace sleeves trembled with each rapid beat of her heart. You're pale as winter milk, Mrs. Kowalski fretted, pinching Elena's cheeks to bring color to them. Are you having second thoughts, child? Elena shook her head, though uncertainty churned in her stomach like spoiled cream. She hadn't seen Thomas since morning, when he'd left to retrieve his mysterious papers from the inn. What if he'd simply kept walking? What if this whole mad charade had been nothing more than a stranger's cruel way of escaping suspicion? But no, she'd seen something real in his eyes when she'd claimed him as her betrothed. Recognition, gratitude, and beneath it all, a longing so profound it had made her chest ache. Here, Mrs. Kowalski said, placing a crown of late-blooming roses on Elena's head. Found these growing wild behind the church. Stubborn things, blooming when they should be preparing for winter's sleep. Elena's breath caught. Wild roses. Just like the ones Thomas had described in the bomb shelter. The ones that bloomed twice a year in defiance of nature's calendar. Surely it was a sign, or perhaps just the desperate hope of a woman about to marry a stranger. Mrs. Kowalski, Elena said suddenly, what if I'm making a terrible mistake? The older woman's hand stilled on Elena's hair. Child, I've seen 43 years of marriage, buried 2 husbands, and raised 6 children. Want to know what I've learned? Elena nodded, grateful for any wisdom in this storm of uncertainty. Love isn't a feeling, it's a choice. You choose it every morning when you wake up, every night when you lay your head down. The butterflies in your stomach, the way your heart races when he looks at you. That's just the beginning. Real love is what happens after, when you see all his flaws and choose him anyway. But what if his flaws are dangerous? Mrs. Kowalski's eyes sharpened. What kind of dangerous? Before Elena could answer, a soft knock came at the door. Elena. Father Benedict's voice carried a note of urgency. We need to talk. Elena's heart sank. She exchanged glances with Mrs. Kowalski, who squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before opening the door. Father Benedict entered, his expression grave. In his hands, he held a leather portfolio, the kind used for official documents. Thomas returned with his papers. The priest said without preamble, They're interesting. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. What do you mean? Sit down, child. Father Benedict's voice was gentler now, tinged with something that might have been pity. Your young man has been honest about his trade. He is indeed a clockmaker, and a skilled one. But he's also been economical with the truth about other matters. The priest opened the portfolio and withdrew a document bearing official seals. Thomas Brennan is not just any clockmaker. He's a military engineer, specializing in timing mechanisms for devices used in warfare. Elena's mouth went dry. You mean bombs? Among other things, yes. Father Benedict set the papers aside and looked at her with compassionate eyes. He's been working behind enemy lines, helping the resistance sabotage supply routes. 3 days ago, his cover was blown. He's been running ever since. The room spun around Elena. She gripped the edge of the dressing table, trying to process what she'd just learned. Thomas wasn't a deserter. He was a spy, a saboteur, a man whose very presence in their village could bring death raining down on everyone she loved. There's more, Father Benedict continued. He's asked me to tell you that he'll understand if you wish to call off the wedding. He says he should never have let you make such a promise without knowing the full truth." Elena closed her eyes, remembering Thomas's steady presence in the bomb shelter, the way he'd calmed the frightened children, the gentleness in his voice when he described his grandmother's wild roses. This was the same man who built devices meant to kill, who lived in shadows and deception. "Where is he now?" she asked. "In the church, waiting for your decision. He's prepared to leave immediately if you know." Elena stood, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I need to speak with him." Mrs. Kowalski and Father Benedict exchanged concerned glances, but Elena was already moving toward the door. She walked through the village streets like a woman in a dream, her borrowed wedding dress rustling with each step. Neighbors called out congratulations, but she barely heard them. The church was empty except for Thomas, who knelt in the front pew with his head bowed. In the candlelight, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. When he heard her footsteps on the stone floor, he turned, and Elena saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. "You know," he said simply. "I know." Elena walked down the aisle toward him, each step feeling like a choice between salvation and damnation. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas rose to face her, his hands hanging empty at his sides. "Because I hoped. God help me. I hoped I could be just Thomas the clockmaker for a few hours. A man who fixes things instead of breaking them. How many people have died because of what you do?" The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him, but he didn't look away. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I tell myself they're soldiers, that they chose to serve a cause that would enslave our people. But late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder about their families, their children, their mothers who'll never see them come home." Elena studied his face, searching for signs of the cold killer she'd expected to find. Instead, she saw a man haunted by the weight of necessary choices, a man who carried the war's burden in his bones. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "Because someone has to. Because if good people refuse to fight, evil wins by default." Thomas's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Because I've seen what they do to villages that resist. I've helped bury the evidence." Elena thought of her neighbors, of the children who'd cowered in the bomb shelter, of Mrs. Kowalski's gentle hands and Father Benedict's weathered face. These people deserve protection, even if it came at the cost of other lives. "Are you asking me to run away with you?" she said. "To leave everything I've ever known? I'm asking you to save yourself. To choose a safe life with a good man who won't bring danger to your door." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes intense with desperate honesty. "I'm asking you to be smarter than I've been." Elena looked around the church where she'd been baptized, where she'd taken her first communion, where she'd always assumed she'd marry someone sensible and predictable. The familiar space felt different now, smaller, somehow, as if the walls had contracted around her settled life. "What if I don't want to be smart?" she said softly. Thomas's breath caught. "Elena, what if I want to be like those wild roses you told me about? The ones too stubborn to know when to quit blooming." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his day-old beard, the tension in his jaw. "I've spent my whole life being careful, Thomas. Being the good daughter, the sensible woman, the one who never caused trouble. But last night, in that shelter, I felt more alive than I have in years." "You don't understand what you're choosing," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I understand that I love you." The words came out stronger than Elena had expected, ringing with truth that surprised them both. "I understand that you're a good man doing terrible things for necessary reasons. I understand that marrying you means choosing uncertainty over safety." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I also understand that some chances only come once in a lifetime." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Elena saw the precise instant when his careful control finally shattered. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with desperate tenderness, as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "Elena," he whispered against her hair, "I can't promise you safety. I can't promise you a normal life. All I can promise is that I'll love you with everything I have, for as long as I'm breathing." Elena pulled back to look at him, her heart steady now despite everything she'd learned. "Then that's enough." As if summoned by her words, Father Benedict appeared in the doorway, followed by Mrs. Kowalski and a small gathering of villagers carrying Wildflowers. Are we having a wedding? The priest asked gently. Elena looked at Thomas one last time, seeing past the spy and the saboteur to the man who'd held her through the darkest night of her life. We're having a wedding. But even as they prepared for the ceremony, neither of them saw the dark figure watching from the shadows outside, or the telegram that had arrived at the garrison 20 miles away, reporting suspicious activity in their quiet village. The wedding ceremony began just as the last light faded from the western sky. Elena stood at the altar beside Thomas, acutely aware of every detail. The way candlelight flickered across the ancient stone walls, the scent of wildflowers woven through her hair, the steady warmth of Thomas's hand in hers, Father Benedict's voice carried the timeless cadence of the marriage liturgy, words that had bound countless couples through centuries of joy and sorrow. But Elena barely heard them. Her attention was caught by the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the church's windows, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. Do you, Thomas Brennan, take Elena as your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. Thomas's voice rang clear despite the weight of unspoken promises beneath those simple words. He was vowing to love her, yes, but also to protect her from the dangerous world he'd brought to her doorstep. And do you, Elena Kowalski, take Thomas as your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Elena looked into Thomas's eyes and saw her entire future balanced on this moment. Not the safe, predictable future she'd always imagined, but something wilder and more precious. A life lived at the edge of uncertainty, where love bloomed in the spaces between explosions. I do, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle, almost reverent, but Elena felt its impact like lightning. When they broke apart, she was no longer Elena Kowalski, spinster daughter of a soap maker. She was Elena Brennan, wife to a man whose secrets could destroy them both. The small congregation erupted in applause and congratulations. Mrs. Kowalski wept openly, pressing a hastily baked wedding cake into Elena's hands. Henrik the blacksmith slapped Thomas on the back with enthusiasm that nearly knocked him over. To the happy couple, someone called out, and Elena found herself swept into a whirlwind of celebration that felt surreal after the solemnity of the ceremony. But even as she smiled and accepted well wishes, Elena noticed Thomas's continued vigilance. His eyes never stopped scanning the crowd, the doorways, the dark spaces between candlelit faces. Whatever danger had driven him to their village hadn't disappeared simply because they'd exchanged vows. The celebration continued for nearly an hour before Father Benedict suggested that the newlyweds might want some privacy. Elena felt her cheeks burn as the implication sank in. She was married now, truly married, to a man she'd met less than 24 hours ago. Thomas must have sensed her sudden nervousness because he squeezed her hand reassuringly. Would you like to take a walk? He asked quietly. I thought we might talk. Elena nodded gratefully. They slipped away from the church as the villagers began to disperse, walking hand in hand through streets that looked different in the darkness. Everything familiar had been transformed by her new status, her new name, her new life. I have something for you, Thomas said when they reached the cottage where Elena lived with her mother. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small wrapped package. I know it's not much, considering. Elena unwrapped the paper with trembling fingers and gasped. Inside was a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with tiny roses that seemed to bloom across the metal. When she opened it, she found a pressed flower, a wild rose, dried but still beautiful. From my grandmother's meadow, Thomas said softly. The stubborn flowers I told you about. I've carried it with me for 3 years, through every mission, every close call. It reminded me that beautiful things can survive even when everything around them is dying. Elena's throat tightened. With emotion. It's perfect. Thomas fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. Elena, we need to discuss what happens next. My papers will only fool casual inspection for so long. Eventually, someone will ask questions I can't answer. How long do we have? A few days, maybe a week if we're lucky. Thomas's expression was grim. There are people looking for me, not just military, but others. People who don't forgive or forget. Elena absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the peaceful village she'd always known with the dangerous world Thomas inhabited. What are our options? I have contacts in the resistance, safe houses where we could disappear for a while. But Elena, you have to understand. Once we run, there's no coming back. You'd be giving up everything you've ever known. Elena looked around at the cottage where she'd grown up, at the garden where her mother's lavender grew in neat, orderly rows. This place held every memory of her childhood, every dream of her future. Leaving would mean abandoning not just her home, but her identity. What if we don't run? She asked. Thomas shook his head. Too dangerous. For you, for everyone here. My enemies won't hesitate to hurt innocent people to get to me. As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses' hooves echoed through the night air. Multiple riders, moving fast and purposefully through the village streets. Thomas tensed instantly, his hand moving towards something concealed beneath his coat. Elena, listen to me carefully, he said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a military officer. Go inside. Lock the door. If anything happens, if you hear gunshots or shouting, take the back path to the Kowalski cottage and don't look back. I'm not leaving you, Elena said fiercely. You're my wife now. That means I protect you, even from myself. Thomas's eyes blazed with desperate determination. Promise me, Elena. Promise you'll run if things go badly. Before Elena could respond, the horsemen rounded the corner. 6 men in military uniforms, their faces hard and purposeful in the moonlight. The leader, a thin man with a carefully groomed mustache, dismounted and approached with predatory confidence. Thomas Brennan, he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Or should I say, Agent Nightingale? You've led us quite a chase. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Elena, but his posture remained calm. Captain Mueller, I wondered when you'd catch up. Did you really think you could hide in this backwater village forever? Mueller's smile was sharp as broken glass. Playing house with the local girls? Elena felt ice form in her veins. This man spoke of her as if she were a toy, something disposable in whatever game he and Thomas were playing. My wife has nothing to do with our business, Thomas said evenly. Mueller's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Wife? How romantic. Though I wonder what the lovely bride would think if she knew about Prague, about the bridge you destroyed and the 30 soldiers who died when it collapsed. Elena's breath caught. 30 men, 30 lives ended by Thomas's actions. She tried to process this information, to reconcile it with the gentle man who'd held her in the bomb shelter. They were transporting prisoners to execution camps, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the accusation. Those 30 soldiers were escorting women and children to their deaths. Still making excuses for terrorism, I see. Mueller's attention shifted to Elena, and she felt his gaze like something physical and unpleasant. Tell me, my dear, did your husband mention that there's a price on his head? 5,000 Reichsmarks for his capture, dead or alive. Elena stepped forward, surprising herself with her boldness. Tell me, Captain, did you mention that you're threatening civilians in a neutral village? I'm sure your superiors would be interested to hear about your tactics. Mueller's smile faltered. Slightly. Elena was right. Technically, their village had been declared neutral territory, and military actions here could cause diplomatic complications. Clever girl, Mueller said. But cleverness won't save either of you. We know about the resistance. Cell in the next county, about the supply depot you helped them destroy last month. We know about the coded messages hidden in clock repairs. Thomas's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. How? Your old friend Richter sends his regards, Mueller replied with evident satisfaction. Amazing how quickly loyalties change. When the alternative is a firing squad. Elena saw Thomas absorb this betrayal like a physical blow. Someone he'd trusted had sold him out, had probably been feeding information to the enemy for weeks. So here's what's going to happen, Mueller continued. You're going to come with us quietly, and your charming wife will be free to mourn her husband's unfortunate death in the line of duty. Or you can resist, and we'll be forced to search this village thoroughly for enemy collaborators. I'm sure we'll find some interesting evidence in various homes. The threat was clear. Submit, or watch innocent people suffer for his crimes. Elena felt the weight of the locket against her throat, the pressed rose that symbolized stubborn beauty in the face of destruction. She thought of Mrs. Kowalski's gentle hands, of Father Benedict's compassionate eyes, of all the neighbors who'd welcomed her mysterious husband without question. Then she thought of the resistance fighters Thomas had helped, of the prisoners, whose lives had been saved when that bridge collapsed, of all the small acts of courage that held the darkness at bay. "Captain Mueller," she said, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "I have a counterproposal." Both men turned to stare at her in surprise. Elena lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of determination she possessed. "Take me instead." "Elena." "No." Thomas reached for her, but she stepped away from his protective grasp. "I'm the one who aided his escape," she continued, improvising frantically. "I'm the one who helped him hide. If you want justice, take the actual collaborator." Mueller laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. A pretty gesture, but hardly his. Words were cut off by the sound of church bells ringing frantically in the distance. Not the measured tolls of celebration, but the irregular clanging that meant only one thing. Enemy aircraft approaching the AS if choreographed. Everyone looked. Up at the night sky. There, silhouetted against the stars, were the dark shapes of bombers returning for another raid. In the chaos that followed. Soldiers shouting orders. Villagers emerging from their homes in panic. The growing drone of aircraft engines. Elena saw her chance. But would courage be enough to save the man she'd just married? Or would this night end with both their dreams buried beneath the rubble of a twice-bombed village? The first bombs fell like falling stars, brilliant and deadly against the midnight sky. Elena grabbed Thomas's hand as the ground shuddered beneath their feet, pulling him toward the root cellar where their love story had begun barely 24 hours earlier. "The shelter," she shouted over the growing roar of engines. Around them, villagers streamed through the darkness, their earlier celebration forgotten in the face of renewed terror, but Captain Mueller's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Nobody moves. This village is under military occupation." His soldiers raised their rifles, creating a deadly barrier between the panicking civilians and safety. Elena felt Thomas tense beside her, could practically see him calculating odds and distances, preparing for some desperate action that would likely get them both killed. "You're condemning these people to die," Thomas said, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the bombs whistling overhead. "Only if you force my hand," Mueller replied. "Surrender now, and they live. Keep running, and I'll consider them all enemy collaborators." Elena watched the cruel mathematics play out on Thomas's face. 30 soldiers dead in Prague, hundreds of prisoners saved, now dozens of innocent villagers whose lives hung in the balance. How many deaths could one man's conscience bear? The answer came with devastating clarity as Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. "No," Elena said simply. Both men turned to stare at her, but Elena was already moving. She'd spent her entire life in this village, knew every alley and hidden passage, every weakness in the old stone buildings. As another wave of bombers approached, she made her choice. "Mrs. Kowalski," she called out, her voice somehow carrying. "Over the den, the old wine cellar beneath the church. It connects to the tunnel system." Understanding flashed across the older woman's face. The medieval tunnel network had been used for smuggling centuries ago, forgotten by everyone except children who'd played hide-and-seek in its depths. Elena had explored those passages as a girl, memorizing their twists and turns. "Take everyone," Elena continued. "Heinrich knows the way." As the villagers began to move toward their escape route, Captain Mueller's attention split between his primary target and the scattering civilians. In that moment of distraction, Thomas acted. He lunged for the nearest soldier's rifle, using momentum and surprise to disable the man before spinning toward Mueller. But the captain was ready, his pistol already drawn and aimed. The gunshot was lost in the thunder of another explosion, but Elena saw Thomas stumble, saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, catching him as he fell. Thomas. His blood was warm against her hands, soaking through the ivory silk of her wedding dress. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." Thomas's eyes found hers, still fierce. Despite the pain. "The locket," he whispered. "Inside, there's a map. Resistance safe houses. Get it to Father Benedict." He'll know what to do. Elena's fingers found the silver locket at her throat, felt the hidden catch Thomas had shown her only hours ago. Inside, beneath the pressed rose, was a tiny piece of paper covered with minute markings. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "You have to." Thomas's voice was growing weaker, but his grip on her hand remained strong. "Elena, you were right about those roses. Sometimes being stubborn is the only way to survive." Another bomb fell closer this time, close enough to shower them with debris. Captain Mueller was shouting orders to his men, trying to maintain control as the world exploded around them. Several soldiers had already fled toward their own shelter, military discipline cracking under the bombardment. Elena looked down at her husband of barely 2 hours, and saw him fading before her eyes. She thought of all the conversations they'd never have, all the mornings they'd never wake up together, all the stubborn roses they'd never plant in some distant garden. But then she heard it, the sound of children crying from the direction of the church. The villagers hadn't all made it to safety. Some were still trapped above ground, still vulnerable to Mueller's threats. "Elena," Thomas breathed. "Go. Save them." She kissed him then, there in the dirt and chaos, tasting salt tears and the metallic tang of blood. "I love you, Thomas Brennan. I love you too, Elena Brennan. Now go be the hero I know you are." Elena stood on unsteady legs, her wedding dress torn and stained with her husband's blood. Captain Mueller was advancing toward them, his pistol still, smoking, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. "How touching," he said. "Don't worry, my dear. You'll be reunited soon enough." But Elena was no longer the frightened girl who'd cowered in bomb shelters. She was a woman who'd found love in the darkness, who'd chosen courage over comfort, who carried the hopes of the resistance in a silver locket around her throat. "Actually, Captain," she said, pulling something from the folds of her dress, "I think you'll find our positions have changed." The grenade in her hand was one of Thomas's. She'd seen him slip it from his coat during the wedding ceremony, probably as insurance against exactly this situation. Elena had retrieved it while cradling his wounded form, her movements hidden by the chaos around them. Mueller's eyes widened in recognition and fear. "You wouldn't dare. You'd kill us all." "Maybe," Elena agreed conversationally. "But I'd also give my neighbors time to reach the tunnels. I'd prevent you from following them. And I'd ensure that Thomas's information reaches the right people." She could hear the sound of the last villagers disappearing into the church, could see Father Benedict's silhouette in the doorway, waiting for her signal. The priest understood. He'd take the locket's contents to the resistance, would honor Thomas's sacrifice by continuing the fight. "Elena," Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "Now, the pin. You have to pull the pin." She looked down at him. This man who'd taught her that love could bloom in the spaces between explosions, that sometimes the most beautiful flowers were the ones stubborn enough to grow in impossible soil. "I know," she said softly. Then louder. "For Captain Mueller's benefit, you have 10 seconds to order your men away from the church." "This is madness," Mueller protested. "You're just a village girl. You don't have the stomach for." His words were cut off as Elena pulled the pin, holding the deadly lever in place with white-knuckled determination. 5 seconds, Captain." The soldiers scattered like startled birds, their discipline finally breaking completely. Captain Mueller cursed and dove for cover behind a stone wall, leaving Elena alone with her dying husband and her terrible choice. But then, miracle of miracles, the bombing stopped. The all-clear siren wailed across the village, and in the sudden silence, Elena heard something beautiful, Thomas laughing. "You magnificent, stubborn woman," he whispered. "You called their bluff perfectly." Elena looked down at the grenade in her hand and realized what Thomas meant. It was a dummy, a training device that looked real but carried no explosives. Thomas had used it as a prop in their desperate theater, betting everything on Mueller's inability to tell the difference in the chaos and darkness. "But your wound," Elena began. "Grazed my shoulder. Hurts like hell, but I'll live." Thomas struggled to sit up, his face pale but determined. "Assuming we can get out of here before Mueller figures out he's been fooled." As if summoned by his words, Father Benedict appeared at Elena's side, his cassock torn but his eyes bright with purpose. "The tunnels are clear," he reported quietly. "Everyone made it to safety. And I believe you have something for me." Elena nodded. removing the locket and pressing it into the priest's weathered hands. Thomas says you'll know what to do with this. Indeed I will. Father Benedict tucked the locket into his robes. There are good people waiting for this information, people who can use it to save many lives. In the distance, Elena could hear Captain Mueller shouting for reinforcements, could see torches being lit as soldiers prepared to search the village. Systematically, their window of escape was closing rapidly. Can you travel? Father Benedict asked Thomas. Do I have a choice? Thomas accepted Elena's help in standing, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. Where do we go? North, the priest said. There's a safe house across the border, people who can get you both to England. You'll have to leave. Tonight. Elena looked around the village one last time, memorizing the church where she'd been married, the cottage where she'd grown up, the streets that had shaped her entire world. She was leaving everything behind for an uncertain future with a man she'd known for a single day. She couldn't wait to begin. 2 hours later, Elena and Thomas walked hand in hand along a moonlit country road, moving toward the distant mountains and an unknown destiny. Elena's wedding dress had been replaced with practical traveling clothes, but she still wore the wild roses in her hair, stubborn flowers that refused to wilt despite everything they'd endured. Any regrets? Thomas asked as they paused to rest beside a babbling stream. Elena considered the question seriously. She'd given up her home, her family, her entire identity. She was now a refugee with a price on her head, married to a man whose past was written in other people's blood. None, she said firmly. Some roses are meant to bloom in gardens. Others are meant to grow wild in impossible places. Thomas smiled and pulled her close, careful of his injured shoulder. I love you, Mrs. Brennan. I love you too, Mr. Brennan. Now come on, we have a whole new life to build. As they walked into the dawn of their first full day as husband and wife, Elena thought she could smell lavender on the morning breeze, carrying promises of distant gardens where stubborn flowers bloomed twice a year, defying seasons and scents. Alike, if this tale of love blooming in wartime's darkest hours stirred your heart, please share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow for more stories of courage, romance, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people choosing love over fear.